Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you all. My name is Melissa Borja. I am assistant professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, and I am so thankful to be here with you all to discuss such an important issue that is facing our country today, and that is religious freedom. We've assembled an amazing group of scholars and experts to help us understand religious freedom, its history, and how it intersects with so many pressing issues that are facing our country today. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and let's get this conversation started. On the far end, we have Steve Green, who is Fred Paulus Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Religion, Law, and Democracy at Willamette University. Next, we have Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, who is Professor of International Relations and Religious Studies at Northwestern University. Next, we have Ruthie Oberg, who is event speaker and archivist at Flower Pentecostal Heritage Center. And finally, we have Jennifer Snow, Director of Extended Learning and Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Church Divinity School of the Pacific. So let's begin with having some historical overview. This panel is going to focus on the 20th century and religious freedom during that period. So my question is, how has religious freedom changed over the course of the 20th century? And let's begin with you, Professor Hurd.
All right, thank you so much. It's interesting to try to talk about religious freedom in the singular in this context. So there are a couple ways I'd like to begin by opening up the concept. And the first is to just talk about religious freedoms and also about the kind of history and politics surrounding the concept and practice of religious freedom. So one way to look at this and think about it is to think about the ways that communities and peoples have gotten along together and found ways to kind of coexist with their differences. And we can think about questions around toleration and religious diversity and religious pluralism in that context. And then we can kind of take a different perspective on religious freedom, which is the government perspective. What happens when it's not really just about individual communities getting by, but becomes a question for the government and the government to define religion and define freedom and to start writing laws and having judges and courts start interpreting what religion is and what freedom is. And that starts to become a very different sort of question. And here we have a lot of the major contests that we see playing out today. And over the course of the 20th century, we've seen religious freedom change and shift and be taken up by the courts, by different groups, by different advocacy organizations, and used in different ways for very different, often conflicting political objectives. So this construct is something that is much more deeply politicized than we sometimes would think it would be. And religious freedom can mean a lot of different things to different people, and it continues to be contested and actively litigated and actively disputed today.
Wow, you stole everything I was going to say. I have the burden of being the lawyer on the panel as well as a historian, so I kind of look at things more from a legal perspective, and I agree completely with Beth. I mean, there was a fair degree of, back up, there are two clauses in the Constitution, well, actually three clauses. One's the no religious test clause, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we have an establishment and non-establishment clause, and we have a free exercise clause. And actually throughout most of the 20th century, particularly in the 1950s on, there was a fair degree of consensus about what free exercise is for. It's to try to ensure that religious minorities have full access to the political sphere, and so it was benefited, and in many cases for the court, of benefiting Jews, Old Order Amish, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. They were a lot of the litigants, and they benefited from the free exercise clause. The non-establishment principle basically meant government should not be sponsoring religion, should not be advancing religion. And so the rule was for a long time that you don't fund religious institutions, religious schools, and you don't have things like prayer and Bible reading in the public schools. What we've been seeing, though, in the last 20 some odd years, though, is kind of a shift, that the free exercise principle is ascendant and the non-establishment principle is kind of in decline. And whereas free exercise had been used as a shield to protect religious minorities, we're starting to see it being used more kind of as a sword to advance religious majorities. And the court seems increasingly sympathetic to that. And so consequently, if you pay attention to the news, we see all these conflicts about, discrimination against LGBTQ communities on the basis of religion. And so we're in a very, very interesting transition point in the way that the court, and I think to a certain extent, the way that society is looking at this issue of religious freedom.
So I'm hearing that it's a very politicized issue, as Professor Hurd said. It's changing over time. I wonder, before we move on to our second question, which I think will dig deeper into how different identities and perspectives engage in this topic, I wonder if Reverend Oberg or Dr. Snow, you have anything to add to what Professor Hurd and Professor Green said.
I just think that's completely correct, and it's an interesting way to put it. It's very helpful to see that the two aspects of religious freedom, non-establishment and free exercise, are kind of balanced in a dynamic tension. And so, yeah, I have also thought that historically, religious freedom, free exercise was used to protect religious minorities in terms of worship and identity. And more recently, we're seeing it used more explicitly and strategically to protect the interests of, I wouldn't even say necessarily dominant, but certain religious groups are saying, like, we need to be able to basically discriminate against other people because that is part of our religion and that should be protected by the courts. So that's what we're seeing in the courts more recently, I think.
Agreed. So on the topic of religious minorities and the courts, I think this raises my next question. We all know we live in a very religiously diverse country. And people experience religious freedom and navigate this issue in a lot of different ways. So let's break that down a little bit more and think about it, how it relates to specific themes. And the first theme I'd like to raise is the issue of citizenship and national belonging. So how has religion and religious freedom shaped citizenship and belonging in the United States? And here I'll invite you to think about religious freedom both as an ideal and also as a policy and a politicized ideal, to use a word that Professor Hurd said earlier. So Professor Green, why don't you get us started on this?
Yeah, at least from my perspective, when I talk about religious freedom, it's a concept that's more writ large. It is not synonymous with free exercise of religion. It includes free exercise of religion, but also talks about a regime of the society that exists to keep non-entanglement of religion and government. And so we need to think about it more broadly. On this question about identity, it's always been a work in progress, and we have to realize that. When the nation was founded, 99% of the people who affiliated with religion were Protestant. And so we were kind of considered to be a Protestant nation. At the same time, the founders said, no religious test for public office holding. That was an ideal. James Madison talked about equal conditions of everyone based upon their religion. And so this has always been the ideal that we have had. The reality has often been different. The Know Nothing Party of the 1850s wanted to impose a 25-year citizenship requirement on immigrants and on Catholics. We had Christian-run government schools for Native Americans up until the 1930s, where basically civilization and Christianity were intertwined with citizenship. And so this has always been a struggle within our nation. Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was an immigrant Jew who was on the Supreme Court, loved the ideal, and he talked about freedom being a spacious conception, but still it is something that's a work in progress. So as show how old I am. As recently as 1960, there was a controversy about electing the first Catholic president. We now have a Catholic president, which a lot of people don't realize but as a result, it was very controversial at that particular point in time. And so it is a slow progress. It's something that we are working on. But still, I think it's going to be a long time probably before we have a non-Judeo-Christian president. Probably a long time, in the future before we have either atheist or a Muslim president. So it's something we have to just keep in mind. Again, is a work in progress. My last point, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who retired from the Supreme Court about 15 years ago, she coined this wonderful phrase, and she basically said, government should not be endorsing religion. Why? Because it makes insiders feel like they're privileged. It makes outsiders feel like they're not full participants in the democratic process. That's the ideal that we need to strive.
Thank you so much. I think you're reminding us of these historical events, like these proposals for citizenship requirements. I think a lot of us didn't necessarily learn these things in our education, so I'm glad that you're reminding us of this history. Reverend Oberg, what do you think?
Well, one of the things that we need to remember, as Professor Green said, there's ideals and then there's realities. And we are a nation of principles and ideals. How those ideals play out in actual historical settings may be a whole different thing. As he referred to the 1960 election of President Kennedy, his faith as a Catholic was a huge issue, and there were many who said, I cannot vote for a Catholic, because one of the expectations of citizenship is loyalty to the United States and a principle or an ideal of individualism. And the accusation was, as a Catholic, will he be under the authority of the papacy in Rome, or will he be able to lead the United States by his own personal beliefs of what is good for this country? And that was a huge thing. And you can see some of the changes in that. Biden's faith was not an issue at all. And today, our Supreme Court has a large number of Catholic representatives in it. One of the things when we talk about citizenship that I think it's important for us to remember is not just the requirements for citizenship, but the expectations then of a citizen. And one of those expectations is involvement in the democratic process. And a question that we have faced repeatedly throughout our history and even today is, does religion limit involvement from the perspective of government? For instance, I'm an archivist for the larger scope of Pentecostal Christians. There's more than 100 million in the United States, and so that's who we study. And we need to remember, in Christianity, there's not Christianity, there are Christianities. And that's an important distinction for us to remember. And one of the things that we dealt with some of our groups in this last election, because of so many immigrants from Eastern Europe, some Christian churches will say it is a Christian's duty to vote. Other Christianities will say it is a Christian's duty to abstain from being involved in the political process. And so if you are involved in voting, that goes against your membership in this particular church. And so these discussions of level of involvement, we have also seen the questions as we have elected more people outside of the Christian faith has become a discussion. Is it American to have a Muslim serve in our nation's government? How does that religion come into play? These are questions that we're asking, that we're still discussing and coming to some understanding on agreement of. What is that expectation for involvement, and how does your religion affect your involvement?
Thank you so much. And I love your point that we need to remember that there are Christianities, not just Christianity. That's so critical. And Dr. Snow, do you have anything to add on this question?
I'm just sitting here listening to everyone and thinking how all of these things, they come together in really complicated ways. So we have the idea of like the test for office, and I love how specific that is. That helps us see, okay, that's what the idea was. That was the legal idea, is like there's no religious test for official office holding. But then we start to see that religion is more than just, you say, I'm a Catholic, I'm an Episcopalian, I'm a member of the Disciples of Christ, whatever church or sect or denomination or faith tradition you're from. It's also got this implicit idea underneath it of values of how you live, how you organize your relationships, what's important to you. And cultural traditions, all kinds of things. And what we see is that religion gets applied historically not only to who gets to hold office, but to who gets to literally enter the United States as an immigrant and who gets access to the citizenship process. So historically in the 20th century, early on especially, this was really contested. And we see this in a bunch of court cases around Asian immigration. We have U.S. versus Bhagat Singh Thind in 1922 and U.S. versus Ozawa. Both of these are examples of people that are coming from Asian traditions. And in fact, Ozawa was a Christian, but the court says, no, you know what, you're not white. And this is important because we see that religion and race get conflated together as well. And that's important with citizenship because we have a history of citizenship that originally was restricted explicitly to free white men, then expanded to include African American men after the Civil War, and then gradually expanded. And so religion and race come together as well. And that's why this gets so complex. That's why we see such a complicated and fascinating history of court cases and contestations about who gets to come into the United States, who gets to hold the privileges of American citizenship, and on what basis can some people try to stop them. And that's why we see this very, very complex history. So after, in 1924, we had a big shift in immigration law where it was tightly restricted to immigrants from Northeastern Europe, basically. And then it changed again in 1965. When the basis of immigration law changed in 1965, people from other parts of the world started to come into the United States in larger numbers, larger proportions. And they brought more diversity in their religious practices and in their values. And that provided the challenge and excitement of diversity. For some people, it's hugely exciting. For some people, it's very challenging. And so we see that played out in the courts as well. And that's the whole 20th century. And I don't have that long, so I'll be quiet now. Okay.
Thank you so much. One thing I really appreciate is that you brought in Asian and Asian American perspectives. As an Asian American studies scholar, I think you can look at religious freedom in such a new way if you have a different starting point. And taking an Asian American starting point, as you did, is really valuable. I should mention that Chinese exclusion, one of the arguments against keeping allowing Chinese migrants in is that they are heathen people. And so that's always been a part of the story. So this actually dovetails really nicely with our next question, which is thinking about different religious and racial positions and how different religious and racial groups might see and use religious freedom during the 20th century, maybe as a sword, maybe as a shield, but how are different groups shaped by their religious and racial identities and engaging religious freedom? So Reverend Oberg, why don't you get us started with that?
Well, one thing that might be interesting with that is just a test case story that comes from our movement, the Pentecostal movement, which is a 20th century movement. We did not begin until the turn of the 20th century. And so you can trace a lot of religious history through looking at that movement. In our beginnings, we were a pacifist movement. And so forming, just for one example, the Assemblies of God was formed in 1914. Well, we all know what was happening worldwide and in the nation in 1914. So by 1917, as the U.S. is going into war, it put these churches in a place of having to make some kind of an official statement on their participation in war. And for the Assemblies of God, as well as the Church of God, another white, both predominantly white denomination out of Cleveland, Tennessee, both of them made statements about their non-participation in war and listing themselves as conscientious objectors. And the rationale that they used was on the basic value of human life. Christians do not kill. And interestingly, the Church of God in Christ, which is an African-American Pentecostal movement based out of Memphis, Tennessee, made the same kind of statement about pacifistic understanding and conscientious objector, but with different rationale. The rationale in the writings of their founder, Charles H. Mason, were not so much the value of human life and taking a life, but the dignity of human life and the difference then how war then will take the powerful class will often use the marginalized classes to do their bidding, to fight their war. The war benefits the powerful, but then it's at the cost of the marginalized, the poor, those who are actually having to go into the field. And so when you look at how both of those different pacifistic organizations approach that, we see some of that racial difference. And interestingly, in all three of those fellowships that I mentioned, the Assemblies of God, the Church of God out of Cleveland, and the Church of God in Christ, had pastors who refused to participate in say, the Liberty Loan Sunday, where churches were asked to sell war bonds within their church. There were pastors in all three of them that preached against taking up arms, but only one was arrested, and that was Charles Mason, who was put into prison in Lexington, Kentucky, for preaching against taking up arms, and spent a little time. And as a matter of fact, for religious freedom junkies, as you could call some of us, that's a destination spot, much like Birmingham jail is for Dr. King, Lexington jail is for Charles Mason. And so that question of, can your religious conviction allow you to refuse to participate in government-sponsored, and in that case, conscripted service? Can your religion allow you to do that? And as we came to some discussions in that, we see some of those things changing. For instance, for the 20th century, in the Assemblies of God, as well as the Church of God, not so much the Church of God in Christ, that pacifistic stance softened as we got into World War II, where it looks like we're fighting against an obvious evil in Adolf Hitler and fascism. But certainly in NAM, when we were in the 50s beginning to talk about the fight against godless communism, then that pacifist stance softens, and we see a change of that more prophetic voice coming from the pacifistic Pentecostals into more of a nationalistic supportive time. But it's interesting to see the difference in the way it was approached from black and white Pentecostal churches.
Such a fascinating history. Thank you. Dr. Snow, do you have anything to add? And then after that, Professor Hurd or Professor Green, if you'd like to add any comments.
So I was just thinking about how this idea of religious freedom and the nature of how religion works in this country, in this nation, can be both, it can be a sword in a sense that can be used by both those who are being denied religious freedom and those who are trying to deny it. So the example I was thinking of specifically was around American Indian traditional religions. So I think, and Dr. Green or Dr. Hurd can correct me around the dates, because I'm not fully clear on that, but I think in 1883, American Indian traditional religions were essentially outlawed. They became illegal. You could not practice them. They had to go underground. And that was connected to that idea of the civilization that's appropriate to be a citizen in the United States. And civilization and religion are seen as going together. Civilization is like this giant problematic term, but we'll just like leave it there. There it is. So citizenship and religion are being combined together, and they're being used to exclude or forcibly shape a group of people that has less political power. I think forcibly shape is a good way to think about it. And so American Indians are no longer able to practice their traditional religions, at least in public, at least openly and legally. And certainly in the early years, people were arrested and people were sometimes killed trying to practice their traditional religions. And then through the 20th century, as there comes to be more of a sense of the need to live out a particular cultural identity, to find it again and to bring it back into the life of the people. There's more political push from the people leading in American Indian communities saying we need to be able to practice our traditional religions. And yeah, it's not like yours. It's not like Christian religion. And in fact, sometimes there may be things that are part of it, such as peyote, that may not be acceptable to people that are part of the dominant white Christian tradition, but these are central to us, and therefore we need to have access to them. And so there begins to be a series of court cases that eventually leads to religious freedom for traditional American Indian religions, and I believe it's 1978. Please correct me if that's wrong, but you can see that there's this trajectory, and it's a long time of fighting and battles over this debate between what it means to be religious and to be a citizen, or to at least have political rights in the United States.
If I can just add on two more examples to put them out in circulation for people to think about, very much in line with what Dr. Snow was talking about with reference to Native American or indigenous religion. One is African American religion. During the Black Power movement, there were many groups who identified themselves as religious communities. The MOVE movement in Philadelphia is an example, which was very powerful and influential during the 70s and 80s. And they actually at one point went to court when their founder was in jail, John Africa, and he said, I would really like to have religious exemption on some of the dietary regulations in the prison. And this went all the way up, and they said, nope, you're not a religion. So the FBI was constantly surveilling these and other groups. They were constantly being kind of excluded from the category of religion in order to make it possible for them to be surveilled and repressed and oppressed in many ways. So African American religion has always been a suspect kind of category that's under surveillance. Same holds for Muslim Americans in the War on Terror. And the War on Terror set the stage for all kinds of kind of automatic assumptions that would link people's perceived identity as a Muslim to the fact that they may be quote unquote inclined toward terrorism or in opposition to US policy in the Middle East, or there were kind of a lot of signs and signals that were assumed to be warning signs that someone needed to have, to be watched, to be surveilled, to not be subject to the kinds of freedoms that white American Christianity was automatically subject to. So religious freedom on the margins in marginalized communities has always been something that's subject to removal at any given moment if their forms of politics are deemed to be too radical or too dissenting.
Yeah, and just to put a capstone on what Dr. Snow was talking about, Tisa Winger at Yale Divinity School, a friend of mine, she wrote this really great book several years ago, and I'm not going to remember exactly the title of it.
We have a religion.
We have a religion. Yeah, thank you. And that I should remember the title, because the reason she used that title is that she's a scholar of Native American. And what happened is that Native American religion became recognized as a religion once the Native Americans, this is thesis, started articulating it in kind of the traditional Judeo-Christian model, and basically started separating, instead of being syncretic just in the overall native life, actually started identifying specific things as being rituals of a religious nature. And that kind of made the difference of the recognition of Native American religions. But they had to articulate it in a way that fit within kind of constrained patterns.
And that reshaped the traditions themselves.
Yeah.
So the traditions have to be reshaped in line with recognizable, legible, Protestant shaped. So religion has a Protestant Christian shaped whole, right? It's a word that we use, but we're kind of shaky around the boundaries, and we tend to kind of focus on belief and unbelief.
So this is a perfect segue to my next question. As we've all gestured towards, the United States is very religiously diverse, has become increasingly religiously diverse, especially after the immigration law changes in the middle of the 20th century. And there are a lot of people who have different religions, a lot of people who might not also be religious at all. We have a lot of people who are religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, people who are religiously unaffiliated. So I think my big question here is, what does religious freedom mean when you have such religious diversity, including lots of people who don't identify as religion? Dr. Snow, why don't you get us started here, and then I'll pass it off to Professor Green.
Well, I love how this is all like coming together in a magical way that we did not plan, because Dr. Hurd and Dr. Green both pointed to the fact that religion gets shaped into like this Protestant shaped thing that's centered around belief and ritual. And then, like, when you go to the courts, that's what you're trying to defend: your right to worship, your freedom of belief. But in fact, religion is often much bigger than just belief and ritual. It is also how you organize your relationships, how you organize your time. It can be cultural practices. It can be so many other things. And so one of the things that I'm thinking that I'm thinking about right now is how religion affects people who have different kinds of relationships. So historically, and this is relevant to immigration law and various other ways that one gets rights in the United States through marriage. Marriage was historically limited to a male person, male identified person, and a female identified person, and you can only have one spouse. It's just like monogamy. But historically, there have been many people within the continental United States that do not have monogamous relationships, whose religious or cultural background may in fact be polygamous or built in different ways. And those people have historically been very discriminated against and have had problems seeing their relationships legally recognized. This is historically very difficult for people who are coming as immigrants, for instance. If you have more than one spouse, you can only bring one. So the other person has to stay behind with whatever, probably with whatever children they have, or at best, you could bring those children, but not your spouse. And so that has been difficult for people that are coming from cultures that have some form of polygamy embedded into them, and that polygamy is okay religiously. Historically, this has also been used actually to discriminate against members of the LDS churches, the LDS traditions. And it's one of the things that was a big debate over making Utah a state, actually. And it is very difficult today. I mean, now we do have legal marriage for people that are members of non-heterosexual relationships. But that's only since 2013. So it's only since 2013 that, for instance, a person who is in a same-sex, same-gender relationship, even if it's a monogamous relationship, and their partner was not an American citizen, they could not bring their partner. They did not have the access to the rights of immigration that heterosexual fiancés or heterosexual married people did. And so this is one of the aspects of religious freedom that becomes more complicated, because honestly, if your religious belief says that actually this is not only okay, but important to defend and live out, and there are Christian traditions that will say it is actually very important to defend the rights of people whose relationships are not the same as the dominant cultures. How do you get to live that out? How do you bring that to the courts? Then you have to start shaping it in terms of religious arguments. And so it starts to come into that Protestant-shaped belief and ritual system that we talked about, because that's what the courts recognize, and that's how it becomes a legal argument.
Well, as I said earlier, when the nation was founded, people who affiliated, and basically everyone had some religious tradition. Over 98% were Protestants. As recently as 1990, again, showing my age, I find that recent, 90% of Americans identified as Christian. It is now down to 64%. And even though we have traditionally been a Protestant nation, fitting in within the Protestant boxes, apparently we are now just below 50% of Protestants in the United States, people who identify with religion. So we're seeing this phenomenal shift in religious pluralism that's existing. Some is homegrown in the sense that we now have approximately 30% of the Americans who are non-affiliated, are nuns or something else. And then, of course, with immigration. And interestingly enough, only about half of the immigrants, from what I understand, this is based on the Pew Center's data, only approximately half of the immigrants moving to the United States are Christian, notwithstanding coming from Central and South America. That many more are now coming from Asia, from India, from China. So they're coming from very non-Christian traditions. And that's putting a real tension, I think, a real stress upon the culture, because the privileges that white Protestants have had for so long are now being challenged in many ways within the society. And so, not to start getting political, but I mean, we've seen this new rise of white Christian nationalism, which was very evident a few years ago up by the Capitol, right, where people are fearing that they are losing their privilege. And so consequently, we are in this transition point, right?
Thank you. So just a bit of a heads up, we have about 10 minutes left in our time together. I could hang out with these religious freedom junkies all day and talk, but I'm going to ask one question about thinking about the U.S. and global context. And the rest of you, I want you to start thinking about, if you were to sum up the things that you want people to know about religious freedom in the 20th century, what would say in like one or two sentences? So we'll do a rapid fire question at the end. But before we get to that, let's talk about the U.S. and the world, because you brought up the context of the war on terror, the relations between the US and China is another sort of context that we're thinking about here. Let's talk about religious freedom in a global context. And how has religious freedom shaped the United States' position in the world? And to what extent does religious freedom shape how people see the US and how the US engages in foreign policy? So, Professor Hurd.
Well, I could talk for 5 hours on that, Melissa, but I won't. Don't worry. I will be so fast. So, everything we've said about the politics and history and kind of contestation around religious freedom, around minority groups that we've talked about in the domestic context, just imagine it on steroids in the international relations. The ideal becomes very politicized. The understanding from other countries is that the U.S. is a Christian nation that is promoting Christianity and defending persecuted Christians. And indeed, there is, obviously that's too reductionist, but there is an element of truth in that the legislation that made it the law for the U.S. to promote religious freedom as part of our foreign policy was indeed lobbied for by a series of folks and groups who were really concerned about persecuted Christians. That passed only very recently, almost yesterday, in Steve's terms, 1998, the International Religious Freedom Act. So today it's the law and has been for some time, for decades now, for the U.S. to report on the religious freedom of every single country in the world except for the United States. Why? Because we have religious freedom. We are religious freedom. And so there you see the power of this ideal. And we've spent a lot of time today talking about the big gap between the ideal and the reality. Well, when it comes to foreign policy and global politics, you can imagine that that gap is even bigger, because when we go abroad and say, we're going to tell you you need to rewrite your laws so that they protect religious minorities in a particular way, this stirs things up, this causes problems, and in a lot of cases, it brings up all the same issues that we had at home. And I'll just end with one example, which is the question of indigenous religion. So if you go and look at the International Religious Freedom Report for Guatemala about 10 years ago, you'll see it reports that there are no violations of religious freedom in Guatemala. But what there is massive land expropriation of indigenous Maya people, the Quiche people, when their land is being taken. Who's taking it? Big mining corporations working in tandem with the Canadian government, big bad Canadian government, working alongside a whole bunch of corporate interests that want to get in there and get their hands on those mines. Do the Quiche people protest? They say, our land is sacred. Our freedom, our religion is being violated. Our way of life is being violated. Our spirituality is being violated. Is that seen as a violation for the U.S. State Department? No, that's not. That's not religion. So what counts, what doesn't? It becomes even more intense when it comes to international relations.
Thank you so much. And I wish I could be here for 5 hours to hear about all you have to say.
Kinda hot though.
It is a little hot. And so we have about 5 minutes left. So we're going to do a rapid fire round. Okay. So we spent a lot of time, covered a lot of territory. Let's sum up our time together. What do we know? What do we need to know about the history of religious freedom in the 20th century and why it matters? I'm just going to go down the line, and I want each panelist to say their 1 to 2 sentence summary of what our friends in the audience should know and what they can go and tell their friends at the dinner table tonight about religious freedom in the 20th century. So I'll begin at the end. Professor Green.
Well, not to repeat myself, but it's a work in progress. It's an ideal. We need to not get the self-satisfaction that we have achieved this ideal at this particular point. And we also, once again, need to understand that religious freedom is more than my right to practice my religion. It's my obligation to respect other people's faith traditions or non-faith traditions. It is also to respect this concept of religious equality and not be worried about privilege.
Who gets to define religion? Who gets to define freedom? And could we find a different set of words for living together? Or is it still working, or is it maybe kind of broken? Do we need some new way of finding a way to live together?
Yeah, and if we're going to live in a pluralistic society, we have to learn how to fight for and defend that pluralism. Religious freedom is not just freedom for my religion; it's freedom for all religions. And we need to be as intense on fighting for that freedom of conscience, because once one religion gains ascendancy, even like I said, there's a Christianity and there's Christianities. Even if one religion gained ascendancy, then the divisions within that religion would cause more things. So we had got to understand how to work together to respect each other in a pluralistic society.
I would say pluralism is complex and contested. So pluralism, religious and cultural pluralism, it's actually, we're learning in the history of humankind kind of like a new thing of how to be a nation that is religiously and culturally pluralistic, and where that pluralism is protected by law and values. And so the religious freedom laws are an important tool. They're an important part of that. And because it is contested, those tools are used to contest it. It can be used to clamp down on pluralism. It can be used to kind of erase pluralism and difference, or it can be used to support and protect pluralism and difference. And it's important to think of, where do I come down on that? And how am I going to use and talk about religious freedom in my life and my work?
Thank you so much. These final comments were so constructive, forward-looking, helpful. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Once again, for those of you who joined in the middle of the event, I'm going to do another round of introductions. We had Dr. Steve Green from Willamette University, Professor Elizabeth Jackman Hurd of Northwestern University, Reverend Ruthie Oberg of the Flower Pentecostal Heritage Center, and Dr. Jennifer Snow of the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. My name is Melissa Bohr of the University of Michigan. Few thank yous. Thank you to the National Museum of American Religion for making this amazing panel possible. If you like what you heard, there's information about this organization and a sticker by your seat. Thank you to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Thank you, all of you, for joining us in this conversation today. Have a great day. Drink lots of water and stay safe.